All right, so let's unpack this whole idea of like completion. When a project is officially done in construction.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be like taking a deep dive into some RICS guidance on this.
Okay.
Specifically a publication called Defining Completion of Construction Works.
Right.
Now it's from 2011.
Okay.
But trust me, the core principles are still incredibly relevant today.
Yeah.
Whether you're someone who's like involved in a build, or maybe you're investing in property, or you're just fascinated by these huge projects,
Mm-hmm.
Knowing when something is truly finished can save you a lot of headaches and probably even money down the line.
Well, it's funny because I think that so many of us misunderstand what completion actually means.
Yeah.
We all have this picture in our minds of like the ribbon cutting ceremony.
Right.
But in reality, it's so much more nuanced than that, especially when we think about the scale and the complexity of commercial construction projects.
Yeah. I mean, is a cake complete when it's out of the oven, or is it complete when it's cool, or is it complete when it's frosted?
Right.
What if the frosting is like, a little rustic?
Exactly. Like, I think that commercial contracts love to define completion as this, like, fulfillment of all obligations.
Mm-hmm.
But then construction throws in all these curveballs.
Right.
Like, you've got minor defects, you've got ongoing landscaping, and just, like, the sheer volume of moving parts that you have to keep track of.
Yeah.
So it's really helpful that there is RICS guidance to help us sort of navigate through all this complexity.
Okay, so for those who aren't familiar with RICS, can you just give us a quick rundown of what it is and why their guidance matters so much?
Sure. So RICS stands for the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors.
Okay.
And they're this global organization that sets professional standards for people that are working in the land, property, and construction sectors.
Mm-hmm.
And their main goal is to make sure that you have ethical and competent practice happening in the industry.
Makes sense.
Which is so essential when you've got so much at stake in these projects.
So is this publication that we're looking at, is it like a rule book that everyone has to follow, like to the letter?
No, not really. It's categorized as practice information.
Okay.
So what that means is that it's really about best practices and expert insights that they've gained over years of experience.
Okay.
Think of it more as a trusted guide rather than a rigid set of rules.
That makes sense because even the document itself acknowledges that, and I quote, completion is rarely a scientific or purely logical process.
Right. It knows that real-world projects require a lot of judgment calls and interpretation.
So where does a surveyor fit into all of this?
Right.
Are they just there to say, yep, the building's up, we're good?
Oh, it's so much more involved than that.
Okay.
So the RICS guidance actually outlines 3 levels of service that surveyors provide, and it's all related to completion.
Okay.
So you've got knowing, doing, and advising.
Okay.
So they need to have in-depth knowledge of the contract and the regulations.
Right.
They're doing inspections and certifications,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're actually advising all the parties on the complexities of how completion works.
Okay, so it's a pretty crucial role then.
Yes.
Now let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Okay.
What are some of the key principles that RICS highlights when they're defining completion?
So one of the key principles is that completion goes beyond just the physical work being done.
Okay.
It's about fulfilling all of the contractual requirements.
Okay.
So that means meeting the intended purpose.
Mm-hmm.
It even includes accounting for statements that were made by the contractor before they were appointed.
Oh, wow. So those initial promises that they make about timelines and expertise really matter.
It really does. It's not just about the final product.
Why?
It's about the entire process.
It's about the journey, not the destination.
Exactly.
So this is where things can get really messy then if everyone isn't on the same page about what complete really means.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And to make it even more interesting, different types of contracts can approach completion in very different ways.
Right.
So the document actually mentions a few of them, like JCT, NEC, and FIDI-IC.
Okay.
And these are forms of contract that are used internationally.
Mm.
And each of them have their own nuances when it comes to defining that finish line.
So there's no like one-size-fits-all definition.
Yeah.
It's all about the specific contract that's being used.
Exactly.
Oh.
So, for example, there's this concept of practical completion.
Practical completion.
Yeah, and that basically means that the project is usable for its intended purpose, even if there are some minor defects that still need to be fixed.
Wait, so it doesn't have to be perfect to be considered complete?
Well, in an ideal world, maybe.
Right.
But the reality is that these huge projects almost always have a snag or two.
Yeah.
So practical completion acknowledges that, and it lets things move forward as long as the core functionality is there.
So it's a bit more flexible than I initially imagined.
It is?
Now, what about international projects?
Good.
Do they have like a different take on this whole completion thing?
Well, they often use a term called substantial completion.
Okay, substantial completion.
And this basically means that the project has reached a point where it can fulfill the function that it was intended for, even if there's some finishing touches that still need to be done.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that the criteria for substantial completion can actually vary depending on the project's own characteristics and value.
So again, it comes back to context.
Yes.
It's not just about checking boxes.
Mm-hmm.
It's about assessing the project as a whole.
Precisely. And then when you add subcontractors to the mix, things get even more intricate.
Oh, right. We haven't even talked about that yet. How does completion work when you've got multiple teams working on different parts of the project?
Well, the RICS guidance really emphasizes that you need to align those subcontracts with the main contract.
Okay.
Because the main contractor needs to make sure that any delays caused by a subcontractor don't end up becoming their responsibility.
Because ultimately, they're the ones who are accountable for delivering the entire project, right?
Exactly, even though they've delegated some parts of it to these subcontractors.
Exactly. And then you have things like partial possession, where the client wants to start using parts of the project before the whole thing is officially done. Think of like a shopping mall where they want to get those ground floor stores open.
Yes.
While the upper floors are still under construction.
Exactly.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
Get those cash registers ringing as soon as possible.
Yeah, but it adds another layer of complexity.
You're right.
To defining completion.
Yeah.
You need to have very clear agreements in place.
Okay.
To protect all the parties involved.
Right.
So, like, who's responsible for what?
Yeah.
Who bears the liability if something goes wrong in that partially occupied space?
Right.
These are all the crucial questions that need to be sorted out beforehand.
Okay, so we've talked about the principles, we've talked about contracts, subcontractors, partial possessions. This is a lot to keep track of.
It is, and we've really only just scratched the surface.
Can we get a bit more practical then?
Sure.
What are some of the challenges that actually pop up when trying to define completion in real-world projects?
Okay, so one common practice that we see is certifying completion, even when there are minor outstanding tasks. Yeah, and this is where practical completion really comes into play because it's often more efficient to get the project moving and address those minor things later on within like a pre-agreed time frame.
So it's like saying, okay, we're essentially done, but we'll fix that leaky faucet next week.
Precisely.
Okay.
But even with that flexibility, disputes can still arise.
Oh, of course.
You have contractor versus client,
Yeah.
client versus contract administrator, even disagreements between the subcontractors themselves.
Right.
It happens all the time.
So that's where meticulous documentation becomes super important.
Absolutely, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Every decision, every agreement, every little snag that's identified needs to be recorded.
Wow.
This documentation is proof of completion.
Okay.
It clarifies responsibilities and it can protect everyone if a dispute ends up in court.
So it's not just about building something amazing.
No.
It's about building a paper trail that proves how amazing it is and who did what.
Exactly. And don't forget about the transfer of risk as well.
Oh, right.
Once that client takes possession,
Yeah.
they become responsible for ensuring the works and securing the site.
Which makes sense. If they're occupying the space, then they need to protect it.
Exactly. And this transfer of risk also impacts things like bonds and guarantees and payments.
Oh, wow.
So certifying completion triggers this whole chain reaction on the financial side of things.
I'm really starting to see why this RICS guidance is so valuable.
It is.
It's like a roadmap through this complex landscape of completion.
It really is. And it even goes beyond just the purely technical aspects.
Okay.
It emphasizes how important good communication and collaboration is between all the parties involved.
You mean it's not just about ticking boxes on a contract?
Yeah.
There's a human element to it.
Absolutely. Successful completion often relies on building trust and having that understanding between the client, the contractor, and the contract administrator.
And speaking of the contract administrator, what's their specific role in all of this?
Okay, so they act as this neutral party.
They're objectively assessing the situation and making decisions based on what the contract says and the facts.
Okay.
So it's a crucial role, especially when you've got these conflicting pressures coming from the client and the contractor.
So they need to be like super professional, super objective, and probably have a good dose of patience.
Oh, yeah. Especially when things get heated.
Yeah.
They're really the linchpin to make sure that you have a smooth and fair completion process.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful.
Mm-hmm.
We've learned that defining completion is far from simple.
Right.
And that RICS guidance provides some really valuable clarity for navigating this very complex process.
Absolutely.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. to delve deeper into some specific scenarios outlined in the RICS document that illustrate just how tricky completion can get in the real world. So we're back and ready to dive into some real-world examples, how this RICS guidance on completion actually plays out in these projects.
Yeah, the document's full of these fascinating case studies.
That illustrates all these complexities that we've been talking about.
I was particularly struck by those scenarios where, like, disputes arise.
Right?
Like between the contractor and the contract administrator. It's like this tug of war.
Yeah.
With each side interpreting the contract, in their favor.
Imagine a scenario where the contractor's like, we're done.
Right.
This is it. Sign it off. We're complete. And the contract administrator is like, no.
Right.
There's all these unfinished tasks or defects.
Right.
And that's where the RICS guidance on clarifying the test of completion becomes really crucial.
Okay.
Because it emphasizes being objective and being consistent when you're applying those completion criteria.
So it's not about just like personal opinions or interpretations.
Yeah.
It's about having those clear, pre-agreed upon standards
Exactly.
you can measure against.
And sometimes that pressure to declare completion comes from the client side,
Oh, okay.
not even the contractor.
Interesting.
So imagine the client is eager to move in. Maybe they've got deadlines or they're losing money because there's been delays.
Right.
So they're pushing to occupy the space even before the contract administrator is given the all clear.
I can see how that would put the contract administrator in a very tricky position.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you're caught between the client's urgency, but also your professional obligation to make sure everything is truly done.
And this is where the guidance is so helpful.
Okay.
Because it emphasizes that even under all this pressure, the contract administrator needs to remain impartial.
Okay.
And they have to base their decisions on the contract itself,
Right.
not on external factors.
Right. It's not about making someone happy.
No.
It's about doing the right thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And ultimately, their duty is to protect the client's long-term interests,
Right.
even if it means delaying that move in date.
So they're like the guardian of the contract.
Yeah.
Making sure everyone's playing by the rules and the project is truly finished.
To the agreed-upon standard.
To that standard.
Yeah, they provide that essential layer of objectivity and professional judgment.
Now, what about those situations where a project gets the stamp of completion,
Right.
everyone's happy, and then later on problems emerge?
Yeah.
We're talking about those hidden defects that weren't apparent during those initial inspections.
Ah, yes, those latent defects.
Latent defects, right?
That's where things get tricky with liability.
Yeah.
The RICS guidance explains that, these hidden issues can really impact who's ultimately responsible
Okay.
for the cost of repairs.
So even though a project might have been considered complete, at one point, the discovery of this latent defect throws everything back into question.
Exactly, and that's why the guidance really stresses how important meticulous documentation is throughout the whole construction process.
Okay.
Because having a detailed record of the materials that were used, the inspections that were conducted, any concerns that were raised, all of that can be absolutely vital in determining who's liable if a latent defect shows up down the line.
So it's almost like you're building a case file alongside the structure.
It really is like a parallel process happening.
And speaking of like legal cases,
yes,
the RICS document actually cites a number of like legal precedents.
It does.
That provide insights into these nuances of defining completion.
It does, and it's fascinating.
I love a good legal precedent.
Yeah.
It's like getting to peek behind the curtain and see how these contract disputes actually play out.
Well, there's one case that highlights this principle called the de minimis principle.
Okay.
And that basically means that minor defects, if they're truly insignificant, they might not prevent a project from being considered complete.
So it's like saying, okay, the doorknob is a bit wobbly.
Yeah.
But it's not stopping the door from working.
Right.
So we're not going to like hold up the entire project over this.
Exactly. But the challenge is figuring out what's truly de minimis. Because what seems minor to one person could be a major issue to someone else.
And that's where that expertise of the surveyor or the contract administrator comes in.
Absolutely.
They need to use their judgment to assess these nuances and make the call.
Exactly. And the RICS guidance gives them a framework for making those judgments.
Okay.
It emphasizes that you need to consider things like the intended use of the building, the nature of the defects, and the potential risks involved. So you're balancing practicality with making sure that you have a quality outcome.
It's like a balancing act.
It is.
And there's no easy answer.
Right. Defining completion isn't a one-time event. It's this ongoing process that demands attention to detail, clear communication, and a really solid understanding of the contract and the RICS guidance.
It's a process that requires everyone to be on the same page, working towards that shared goal.
And while we focused on the technical aspects and potential disputes, the human element is just as important.
We touched on that earlier. It's about collaboration, good communication, and a commitment to ethical conduct from everyone involved.
Right. Construction projects involve people. And navigating those relationships effectively is key to reaching that shared understanding of what complete actually means.
For that particular project.
For that specific project. Because a successful project is one where everyone feels like they've contributed to a quality outcome.
Well, this has been a fascinating dive into these intricacies of completion.
It has.
It's clear that RICS guidance provides these valuable tools and insights for anyone involved, whether you're a seasoned professional or just starting out.
Absolutely. And I think a key takeaway is that defining completion is this multifaceted process that requires careful consideration of the contract, the technical standards, the potential risks, and the all-important human element.
And with that in mind, we'll be back after a quick message to wrap up our discussion and leave you with some final food for thought. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You know, it's amazing how something that seems as simple as saying a project is complete can be so nuanced in this world of construction.
It really can.
Especially, you know, in the world of these big commercial projects.
That's the thing about RICS guidance. It really helps illuminate those nuances. And one of the biggest takeaways, for me at least, is that defining completion. It's not just a technical process. It's about managing those expectations and fostering that clear communication every step of the way.
You've talked about contracts. We've talked about potential disputes, you know, the role of the contract administrator. But you're right. It always circles back to the people who are involved in these projects.
It does.
You know, clients, contractors, subcontractors, they all need to be on the same page.
Absolutely. And that's where that human factor comes in. And the RICS publication really stresses that a successful completion often hinges on the ability of all those parties to communicate clearly, build trust, and find those solutions that work for everyone. It's not about winning or losing. It's about achieving that shared goal.
It's a good reminder that even in this industry of concrete and steel, it's those human relationships that make projects succeed.
It really is.
And a big part of that is having that clear documentation throughout the entire process.
Absolutely. Documentation isn't just about covering your back legally. It's about creating this transparent record of how the project evolved, what decisions were made, why were certain materials chosen, any challenges that were encountered. It all creates this comprehensive history of the structure.
It's like a storybook of the building.
I like that.
You know, from its earliest stages to that final moment of completion.
And it serves multiple purposes. Obviously, it's proof of completion, but it also clarifies those responsibilities. And it protects everyone involved if those disputes arise down the line. It's like building a case file alongside the physical building itself.
I like that. Now, the RICS guidance even touches upon the psychology involved in completion.
It does.
You know, for example, clients might be really eager to take possession before the work is fully finished. Maybe because they're excited to see their vision come to life or they're just feeling the pressure of deadlines.
That's a very real dynamic. And it highlights the importance of having a contract administrator who can really remain objective. They need to be making those decisions based on the contract and those professional standards, not on external pressures or emotions.
Not because someone is, you know, yelling the loudest.
Well, exactly.
It's about doing what's right.
Yes, it's about protecting the client's long-term interests, even if it means having those tough conversations about potential delays.
So the contract administrator is wearing a lot of hats then.
They are.
Technical expert, mediator, guardian of fairness, and sometimes even a bit of a therapist when those tensions are running high.
That's a great way to put it. They're really the linchpin in ensuring that the completion process is smooth and transparent, and ultimately that it delivers a project that meets those client needs while upholding those high professional standards that are set by RICS.
It's been a fascinating journey exploring this often overlooked aspect of construction.
It really has.
It's clear that the RICS guidance provides these incredibly valuable tools and insights for anyone who's involved, whether you're like a seasoned developer or you're just starting out in the industry.
I completely agree. And I think the key takeaway for our listener today is this. Defining completion is a process. It's not a single event. It requires that careful consideration of those contractual obligations, the technical standards, the potential risks, and always the human element.
So much to think about. We'd like to leave you with this. Imagine you're commissioning a building.
Okay.
What clauses related to completion would you insist on having in that contract to protect your own interests and make sure that you have a successful outcome?
It's a great question to ponder.
Yeah.
And perhaps even discuss with your architect, your contractor, or your legal advisor.
Right.
The more informed you are, the smoother that journey to completion will be.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of construction completion. We encourage you to explore the full RICS document for even more insights.
Yes.
It's readily available online and a treasure trove of knowledge for anyone who's fascinated by this field. Until next time.